Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series, where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild supplemental guide, The Malady Codex, designed by Jason Bakos and Themis Paraskevas for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shout out to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Brian, Richard, and Joe. And gold patrons, RPG, Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, and Pretty Boy and Yuma. Thank you all so much for your support. I can think of nothing more appropriate than reviewing a guidebook about disease than when I am sick. Kate's been watching my videos this week during my Patreon Monday update video, and then yesterday with the Let's Play live stream of Darkest Dungeon. I've been going downhill steadily, and then today I woke up really feeling under the weather. Pretty sure it's just the common cold. Thankfully, nothing nearly as awful as the diseases presented in this book. But it was just funny the way my schedule actually lined up. This was the next one on the list, and I basically have the common cold right now. But I've got my Kleenex tissue box, I guess I should say. I'm not sponsored by Kleenex. My glass of water. I've taken some off-brand Dayquil, and we're gonna get through this together. But I apologize if I'm sounding a bit nasally and snorty and coughy. That is not because I am trying to drive home the theme of disease. Hopefully I will get over this in a couple days. So, the Malady Codex is all about diseases, which is a thing in D&D, certainly. Usually associated with like swamps and those kind of settings. I believe not until maybe like Tomb of Annihilation where there are actual like disease written in as a thing like in that book. I think the Dungeon Master's Guide might have had some as a thing, and I mean there's some characters like monks and paladins I think get immunity to disease, so that is definitely a thing there. I don't think disease is as deadly as it was in previous editions. I remember like it could be like level draining and all this bad stuff. What this one does is really more of there are mechanics there, but it's really more like story stuff, which I think is good. That's kind of what I want from disease. Like, yeah, give me the mechanical stuff for it, but also just like give me good ideas about how to use disease. And these are all, for the most part, drawn from real world maladies, either historical epidemics and pandemics to just modern day like swine flu and mad cow disease, back to like leprosy and cholera and the bubonic plague and all that stuff. So written by medical students who know their shit, certainly when it comes to diseases. We'll go through this pretty quickly. I probably won't go like piece by piece or anything, just because again I'm not terribly feeling up to the task, but I do want to give it a proper review. There is a nice little introduction here, and one thing that this adventure does, which I want to see a lot of adventures do, and maybe I'll get tired of this eventually, but is doing the thing that Wizards does with their supplemental guides with Valos and Mordenkainens, is that they have they create this fictional character who then is the voice of that material. So you get these nice little blurbs about their point of view, and this they do the same thing here with this Ascisis character, which is way underused. I would have liked to see much more of this. These are these little yellow text boxes that are used, kind of just a little blurb at the beginning of each one, but it's nice to have, and it's actually an NPC created later on in the appendices, which is nice to see. There's a whole section here on how to handle diseases for characters that can handle disease, and it basically says like, look, some of them are penetrative, which means you can't just cure this disease through regular disease curing means, that you might slow the disease down, but the disease is so strong that it will get through. But for the most part, just let those characters do that thing, because it does acknowledge the fact that, look, diseases don't come into play that often, and that's part of what these characters can do, is they're just good against disease, so just let them be good against it. So I kind of like that a lot, with the fact that, yes, some of them are penetrative and will kind of fuck you up regardless. But it's just good notes here about what are the various like spells and abilities and things that can cure disease. So that's nice to have. The diseases, there are 11 of them in total, and they are organized, as you can see here, origin, causes, symptoms, diagnosis, cure, and potential plot hooks that you as the DM can use to employ them. They're also divided in categories, either magical, divine, or natural. So it's either where did that disease come from? Basically, any kind of like microbial disease is considered natural. Oh my gosh. Ugh, I apologize. And some of them are lethal and non-lethal. So you could have some that are just very, very painful to live with, but otherwise will not kill you on their own. So you get a really good variety here of different sources and severities for sure. This first one, this Druids Curses, I think the most severe, based on the plague with the like the bleed. It's a blood illness. With the lymph nodes all swollen up and all that. It's just it's classic nasty. If you played like the Dishonored games, I believe that was a big. The first Dishonored, actually, I don't think the second one did that. But essentially the plague, which is nasty pants, very very bad. And it mentions in the like plot hook section, it's like, look, this is probably a world-ending pandemic, and caution when using something like this. The diagnoses are always going to be usually medicine checks. The cure can vary. Some of them do have actual cures. In fact, this Druid's Curse probably has the most interesting cure in that it could be a side quest in of its own, which is to get a certain flower from a shambling mound, which is really cool. Although it mentions the fact that you don't get a lot of material out of one shambling. It'd take like an army of shambling mounds to cure like a city, for example, and those things aren't usually very common. But that could be a cool idea for a plot hook, is to, the city is gripped by this. You need to go and find a shambling mound to kill, which would be nice. Mad Mage's disease is a neat idea, but I think it's actually way too complicated the way it's presented. I like the idea of a disease that progresses over several stages. That's very diseasey themed. It starts off maybe more dormant and then it gets stronger. But the way it's presented here is that every time you use a certain damage type, you take damage. But then if you switch and use a different damage type, it starts over. So it's something you have to keep track of either as a player or as a DM as you go. And then when you reach like the max stage, it manifests into this basically this NPC that just like pops out of you essentially, which is a neat idea. It's like this Metroid style sentient disease-looking creature thing, which is really cool. I wish there were more monsters here too. I think if you're gonna, you're either gonna present it as like we're just gonna cover the diseases, or make it, with the codex here, is we're gonna cover the diseases in different formats, and one of them is to include like NPCs and magical items, and even NPC stat blocks. And in that case, I would have liked to see a lot more of those towards the end, but it's a neat idea to have this creature pop out. And in the plot hooks, it mentions like a good way of using that is to actually don't inflict this on your players, but instead give it to an enemy spellcaster who is like casting spells and then like get in pain from that, which is an interesting idea. I've never thought of inflicting a disease. When you think about diseases, you think about your players having to deal with the disease, but in this case, you could afflict an enemy with the disease. And then it's, you kind of tease the fact that they're in pain after using these abilities. All of a sudden, it pops out that, in the case of this disease, it literally like creates this other creature, which could be a really interesting thing to do. So I like that plot hook, particularly, even though I think the disease itself is a little too complex in its mechanics. This one has one of the better story hooks to Oxytorus's Toxic Breath. Literally just a black dragon who increased the potency of their poison breath to basically cause cholera, which cholera is like the diarrhea disease, which, it's funny to make jokes about that, but holy shit, diarrhea is like bad. Like people used to die from it, and really you still could, because it's dangerously dehydrating. In addition to being just super horribly uncomfortable, obviously, but it literally will dehydrate you super quick. and it's just, yeah, the idea that a dragon basically rules over his people because he's got this horribly debilitating dragon breath is a neat story hook. Not all of the story hooks are that good. In fact, the first half are probably the best story hooks. Beholder Spores, which is clearly inspired from a specific part of Tomb of Annihilation, which features a beholder that uses this mold everywhere that it can pop its eyeballs out at. This one doesn't so much do the eyeball popping thing as it is just the mold itself. Acts more like you would think like disease-ridden spores would. They just kind of explode and do nasty stuff. But this one also works up in stages, which is, I like the idea of the stages. I think that's a cool thing for disease to feature for sure, and not too hard to keep track of. Just that the Mad Mage virus was maybe a little more complex to keep, a little too complex to keep track of. Although you do get separate handouts, basically for the DM to keep track of some of these things too. They are included in this purchase. The Mind Flayer Network and the Demonic Virulence are both very, very themed towards their specific creature involvement. The Mind Flayer Network obviously is like a disease of the mind. This one I believe is the one based off of Mad Cow. That obviously has to do with Mind Flayer, which is that's a great example of taking a real-world disease and applying it to D&D. And in this case, it's like Mind Flayers being able to see out of that person's mind, and mechanically it translates to either a long or short-term madness effect, which is nice to see. And again, nice, not all the diseases are physical. There are diseases of the mind, so that's nice to see them there. Demonic Virulence is actually, it seems like it is based on, what is it? Very loosely derived from the progressive effects of atmospheric pollution caused by the ever-growing human population. So that's actually just based on pollution of the air and the effects it can have on you. And in this case, it gives basically demonic madness to people in the area. Like it's like the underworld, the abyss. Thank you. The abyss is what it's called in this universe. Is like leaking through and can cause these kind of effects, these demonic effects on people, which is nice to see. Tetanus / Lockjaw is pretty obvious, and also is a really weak plot hook. It's just like, look, you can afflict weapons with that, and it can cause paralysis. If you just wanted to add, a stronger, to any fight, or maybe some kind of creature can do that or something. That one, Necrophorum, isn't too interesting either. It's a very simple like animal disease that could be used for low-level adventures, like helping a farmer. Interspecies sexually transmitted disease. They had to throw an STD in there. This one is crazy because it specifically involves interracial sexual coupling that results in different strains. And the plot hook is even like, look, let's see. And very important note, this disease could be the means for racism to spread or occur. We do not advise that you seek to expand on this aspect of the disease, but if you do, make sure it's through the mouth of a vile or non-respected NPC, one whose opinion and worldviews aren't that valuable. That seems it seems like an obvious content warning, or like, hey, remember, racism is bad. Like, thank you for reminding everybody of this. But obviously, yeah, when you have different races manifesting different symptoms, and the fact that interracial couplings create these symptoms, that is the basis for, it could be, of a racist. Which that can be a story. Like you could make a story out of that. Maybe there's with obvious real world parallels there. Of maybe there's a group of like purists that say, hey, this disease is spreading, but specifically with interracial coupling. So that's why we can't be doing it with other races. There's actually a list here you can see of different races having different effects from this disease. The dwarf one is the most insane. They vomit acid every 30 minutes. That is ridiculous compared to some of these, which are like, what is it? The tiefling, you only discern shades of gray. You lose, like, I guess you get color blindness, lethargy, skin disease. Like, all of these are like pretty bad, but vomiting acid every 30 minutes is real fucking bad. So dwarves got the short end of the stick on that one. King's Evil is leprosy, which is actually not nearly as awful as I thought it would be. In this case, it's more based on the fact that there's this certain like royal line that can cure you. And Talona's curse is actually a divine inspired, which it seems like it's just an excuse to use this Cleric of Pestilence stat block, who can basically just cast a spell that bestows a disease on people. So overall, there's a good variety here. Some of them are way more interesting than others. I think the ones that are more based on actual like characters and have stories involved with them are much more effective than the ones that just feel like they're pretty generic. But you do get, almost a dozen here, so the good outweighs the not quite as good, if that makes sense. Um, the appendix at the end, I like this. This is actually one of my favorite sections of this book. I wish there were more. They give NPCs, which has to do with, there's a SS. I'm not gonna try to fucking Akes. Oh, I totally fucked it up. Akesius. Wow. All right. Thank you for the pronunciation guide. Akesius. I'm gonna stop. And then the Whistler, which is a Kenku, which I love this because in the medieval times, and I know this wasn't nearly as popular as our mythology has popularized it, but it's that beaked, the plague doctor mask, because they had like herbs and shit in the beak, and they thought they could smell that, and that would ward off the bad diseases as they worked, and it was a very like not very well used thing, but it's such a striking image that it's become very popular. I'm playing Darkest Dungeon right now, and the plague doctors wear that mask and it looks cool. And I think the idea of a Kenku embodying that plague doctriness is a really, really neat idea. That's fun here. I would have liked to see a lot more NPCs. Monsters I would have liked to see more of because I really like the idea of like this. It's like this Metroid-like creature that manifests because it's a magical-based virus disease. So I think that's cool. I would have liked to see a lot more here. The ones that are here are pretty neat. There's actually two of these Malady. GP 120 and GP 41, which I assume are specific like medical terminologies, and you even get magical items. Excuse me. That have to do with diseases, either curing disease or warding off disease, or something to that effect. So there's a lot of neat little bits here that are like disease adjacent that have that kind of help complement the actual diseases that we get notes on, and I really like this section. I would have liked to see even more included here because I think those are as interesting, if not more interesting, than the actual diseases themselves. Let's go over my quick pros and cons for the Malady Codex. Pro, we've got 11 D&D friendly diseases organized by origin, symptoms, cures, and potential plot hooks. So you've definitely got a lot of material to work with, and I think they work for the most part. The quality is good. Pro, many of the diseases are based on real-world counterparts, such as tetanus, cholera, and leprosy. And I think this creates a nice, easy touchstone, even if you're not, a medical student or well-versed in, sicknesses or diseases and all that. Having these based on very famous or infamous diseases, and then instantly we know kind of what that translates into in terms of how that disease would work. So it's easy for the DM to see, okay, well, how would that work mechanically? So, and like what kind of medicine checks would you need and all those things. So I think that works quite well. Pro, disease healing abilities and spells listed at the beginning. I think that's very useful to have included. And kind of just acknowledges the fact that certain classes, clerics, monks, and paladins, are good at dealing with disease. And it says, instead of trying to overcome that, instead make that a point. Like make that a character's focus. Like if you're, and even mentioned somewhere, it's like, yeah, your high-level monk probably forgot that they were immune to disease, but this would come in like really handy because how often does that actually come up in a D&D campaign? Not that often, and that is a feature of that class. So let them shine. Like make this. A main advantage that this particular character class has. So I think that's a nice thing to acknowledge. And pros, the appendices are great. Several NPC stat blocks and magical items, all with a disease theme. Very, very cool. Cons, the Mad Mage virus is a neat idea, but I think it's a little overly complicated to keep track of. The way it's got this system that you have to kind of restart, and then if things do multiple damage, you have to figure out which one, and then all this, and it's just so many of them are not complicated at all, to where that one particularly jumped out at me as being just overly complicated compared to the rest. It's much more like story and theme rather than mechanics, except for that one disease is very like mechanical driven. The other con is that some of the plot hooks are just a few generic notes rather than specific stories, which is a bummer because I feel like some of the best things that these kind of compilations can offer is nice like story examples of how to use that thing in your campaign. And in this case, about half of them are really, really good, and then the other half are just not quite. It is kind of generic, like, hey, this is for maybe a low-level party or something. Instead of using like actual character, like names and situations, and just as examples. So for a plot hook, I really want it to be like a specific plot hook and not just generic DM notes, for example. Final verdict for the Malady Codex. With nearly a dozen diseases inspired from real-world maladies, the Malady Codex provides a variety of interesting and terrible afflictions to add to your campaign. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com, and you can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. You can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and I will work on feeling better soon. Thank you.